We're fortunate to have with us today Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev has had a very storied career, an influential career. Started as, I think he'll correct me if I'm wrong, professionally as a protester and if that's a profession, for the cause of Soviet Jews, then won a extremely uphill battle for the Los Angeles City Council at the young age of 26, became a city councilman for served for almost 20 years, then went on to serve 20 years as a member of the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles. And I think it's safe to say, it's not even safe to say, it's not an understatement, that Zev has influenced just practically every policy that is affecting Los Angeles City and County today. I don't even think if I could mention one that he has not had his hands on in some way, from transportation to crime, to the arts, to development, to healthcare, just everything. And now he's the author of a memoir I'm highly recommending, Zev's Los Angeles, a political memoir from Boyle Heights to the halls of power. And there's one footnote that is missing that is important, at least to me. He also gave Terry Magady his first job out of college about 44 years ago. It's not on your Wikipedia page. So let's dig right in. Welcome, Zev.
Thank you, Terry. Good to be with you.
I want to start with what you started with in your book, which is your grandfather, your maternal grandfather. And you quoted him as follows. He said, each generation inherits and bequeaths. And I want to talk and ask you about what you inherited, but not only the inspiration you inherited, but the challenges you inherited too. Because when I read what you said about your grandfather, it was very inspiring. But at the same time, you had a grandmother too, his wife, that, you'll tell me if I'm saying too strongly, abandoned him and your mom at a very young age. And then you go on to your own parents who influenced you, your mother who influenced you, but she tragically passed away when you were just 10 years old. And then your father, who also had a tremendous influence on you, you say, but on the other hand, you did describe yourself as a latchkey child in many ways. So if you could share with us, what did you inherit from all of this that really that makes up the Zev Yaroslavsky that has had such an influence on the city, the county, and elsewhere?
Well, let me start by, first of all, thanking you and the Beverly Hills Bar Association for inviting me to this session. When I first started writing this book, which is over 7.5 years ago, I was determined to write about my grandfather, my grandparents, and my parents. But the first 30% of the book is about my pre-public service life, and a portion of that is my pre-birth. And a good friend of mine, Tim Rutten, who passed away last year, or in the last year, when he read an early manuscript, he said that publishers will want you to cut that part of the book out. He said, don't. He said, because it's why you are who you are. My maternal grandfather was a huge figure, period. He was a huge figure in the old country in Ukraine, in the city of Poltava. He was one of the early labor Zionists. He was part of that generation that converted Hebrew from what was a language of scripture for 2,000 years, and now became a more functional language. There was no word for traffic signal or taxi cab in the Bible. So he was part of that great generation, the late 19th, early 20th century. And he was also a genius in the science world. He wasn't a professional scientist, but he was fascinated by science, physics. He invented things on paper, including a helicopter. He did not know that Da Vinci had crafted a schematic for such an aircraft. He was fascinated by the idea of having an aircraft that could land and take off vertically. I mean, this is the kind of thing he regaled his students in. His students were Hebrew students, Hebrew school students. That's what he ran in Ukraine. So when people say, well, who's the one person in world history you'd like to have met? I said, I'd like to have met my maternal grandfather. He died 8 years before I was born. Fortunately, we have a lot of his writings, and one of the things that your quote is very powerful. He believed in issues that were bigger than himself. The notion that the Jewish state, which had been dismantled for 2,000 years, at least physically dismantled, could be reconstituted was about as preposterous a notion as me running a sub 4-minute mile. But he believed in it, and he never had a chance to go there. But his daughter did, my mother, and his son-in-law, my dad, and he lived vicariously through them. So what do I get from him? What did he bequeath to me? Ethics. First of all, he was an incredibly ethical human being, had great integrity, compassion, and he was incredibly compassionate. He was the most giving person. He had nothing to give other than his intellect. He was not a wealthy man by any stretch of the imagination. None of my relatives were, sadly, or not sadly, as the case may be. But he bequeathed that to me and my sister, and of course to my mother, who was his only child. And yeah, my grandmother, his wife, they married. She was 17, he was 34. I believe the best we can figure it out, they got married around 1909, 1910, and as time went on, there was less and less between them. And she had a lover in the old country. She didn't want to come to America with him, and they finally made a deal. She'd come with him for a year, set him and my 13-year-old mother to be, and then go back to Stalinist Soviet Union and live with her significant other, which she did for the rest of his life. She never divorced my grandfather because he wouldn't give her a divorce, and so they lived together. He died in 1958. She died in 1964. I never met my grandmother. My sister did, and a couple of years after my mother died. And of course, there was a lot of tension between my mother and my grandmother. First words out of my grandmother's mouth to my sister were, "Did your mother ever forgive me?" And I asked my sister, I said, "So what did you say?" Because of course she didn't forgive her. And she said, "Well, I didn't want to lie, but I finessed it." She said she really didn't talk about it much. But the fact is, after World War II, there was a period, a window after the war where American families could send care packages to Russian Soviet families during that period, 46, 47, 48. And my mother sent 2 packages to my grandmother, one for her and one for her significant other. And she enclosed a note in the one for her. She said, "This one is for you because you're my mother. The second package is for Mendel because he survived the war." My mother was an incredibly compassionate human being, inherited that obviously from her father, but she was also incredibly principled, and she didn't hide things. What you saw was what you got. And so I'm the product of my grandfather. Sadly, I don't know as much about my paternal grandfather. He and my paternal grandmother were evacuated to Kazakhstan and Siberia during the war. A lot of people were evacuated east to be out of range of the Nazis, and both of them died there during the war, not as a result of the Nazis, but probably as a result of the hardships of traveling in that environment. And I know very little about them, but I know a whole lot about my grandfather, who wrote voraciously and had wonderful things to write. And he wrote he wrote in Russian, he wrote in Yiddish, he wrote in Hebrew, and his Hebrew was kind of Shakespearean Hebrew. I mean, if you read it, you think you're reading some, great literary scholar, which he was. So, the fact that we're spending 5 minutes on my grandfather at the beginning of this talk suggests to you how important he has been in my life, and we have a very small, a very short, several seconds snippet of him in New York in 1937. My dad was the photographer with an 8mm camera, and my mother was walking him down Second Avenue in New York, and he's walking towards the camera, and then he looks right in the camera with a glint in his eye and a smile, and then the film ends. the 3-minute spool ends, and that captures who he was.
Zev, it's almost as if his influence kind of overtook whatever else was going on there with your grandmother. It was that's what influenced you.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. He was very depressed. And my mother was very depressed. I mean, your mother leaves you to go back to the country that she was basically escaping from, and took great risks to come here at the time in 1923, both in getting out and in coming here, and then to have her mother leave her. It was the overlay of his. I don't want to say depression, because I don't know that it was clinical depression, but he was depressed. He was saddened by the whole thing. And he wrote back to his friends back in the old country. We have copies of those letters, and one of them I love. I write about it in the book, write about all of this in the book. He says he's teaching these 8-year-old boys in New York, and they're misbehaved, and they don't pay any attention, and they throw spitballs across the room with each other. I mean, same thing I used to do in Hebrew school when I was 8. And he says the only thing these boys seem to care about is this game called baseball. In 1926, 27. Yeah, I would see baseball or Talmud, which is it going to be? So with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, I felt his pain. but he was.
How about even your mother? You say influenced you. I mean, unlike your grandfather, who you didn't meet, your mother, but she was gone after 10 years of your life.
Yeah. So
there's an influence.
I'm asked often, do you have any regrets? And usually that's a euphemism for, do you have any regrets you never ran for mayor? I do not regret. I never regret that I never ran for mayor, and but I do have some regrets. I once gave up an opportunity to sit next to Sandy Koufax at a Dodger game because I had a prior commitment. That was a very foolish decision to make. But the real regrets that I have is, number one, that my parents never got to see how I turned out. My dad died when I was 24. He didn't know, as I didn't know when I was 24, where I was headed. And could have been any number of directions, and the least of which were on anybody's radar screen was that I would get elected to the LA City Council. That wasn't even a consideration at that time. And of course, my mother died when I was young. But what she, first of all, one of the nice things about there are a lot of bad things about being well known, especially well-known politician. But one of the wonderful things is that there are a lot of people in this town who are influenced by both my mom and dad. And especially in the case of my mother, who I never knew as an adult. I knew her at the most as a 10-year-old. I've gotten to know her through the myriad of folks who were her students at City College. She taught Hebrew and math at City College. She taught Hebrew school. She was active in the community in Boyle Heights and City Terrace. And they all tell me, stories about her. And I mean, there are two people that I know of who named their children after my mother. Now, when somebody names their children after their teacher, that teacher is special. So I've gotten to know her that way. But what I do remember of her personally was she sat my sister and I down every Saturday morning and read from the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, we were not religious. My parents were not religious. They were socialists, lowercase s. They were labor people, they were union people, and but my parents believed that the Bible was a historical book. And of course a book of ethics and challenging questions and things of that sort. But for an 8 and 9-year-old, it was, you know, the one that of course comes to mind to everybody is Cain and Abel. You know, what do you learn from that? She would ask me. You know, would you lie to God about your about what you did to your sister if you did something to your sister? And these ethical questions. But that was not important because frankly, an 8-year-old, these are very profound questions, and you get an 8-year-old answer to a very profound question. It's not a very good use of time. What was the important thing was the discipline that she instilled in me and my sister, that before you go out and play, before you do anything else, before you go to watch the Hollywood Stars at Gilmore Field, at the 1 o'clock baseball game, you're going to sit down at 9 o'clock, and for 45 minutes we're going to read the book of Genesis, and it really inculcated in me, you know, that before you do the fun things, you know, do the things that you're obligated to do, and that stuck with me the whole rest of my life. And
you know, it's interesting that you don't. It's not only that you get from that, like the tremendous influence a parent has a child for a child at a very young age, you know, at a very young age. And in your case, the influence a parent can have and what you've learned and grown from your parents after they were gone, from finding out more about them and hearing about them from
yeah, well, in a way that, I mean, it's a substitute for having her around when I was growing up. It's the next best thing, because for a lot of people, for most people, that doesn't happen. I mean, you have a handful of friends who remember your parents, but I remember, I mean, this is a story I tell in the book also, a very controversial issue of whether we should remove the Christian cross from the county official seal, and we were challenged by the ACLU, and there was no question that we had to remove it, because the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, had ruled that you cannot use an official emblem to endorse a religion, and we never took it off on our own, even though it bothered me. Not because I'm Jewish, but because I believe in the First Amendment. I'm a First Amendment hawk. But when the ACLU threatened to sue us, our lawyers, uncharacteristically, this audience will appreciate this, they didn't say, well, on the one hand you could win, but on the other hand, you know, you could lose. Our lawyer said, you will lose. If this goes to court, you will lose, and you'll have the privilege of not only paying your own legal fees, but you'll get to pay the ACLU's legal fees as well. So we pulled the cross off the county seal, and you know, you know what hit the fan, and the phones were ringing off the hook. The right wing shock jocks on radio and television, in the case of Bill O'Reilly, were making hay out of this thing, and we got, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of calls over a period of a week to 10 days. And I went up to the front office to help you know, boost the morale of my secretaries who were taking all these incoming calls, and I sat at the front desk, and I started answering the phone, and the first call I get, I couldn't make this up, the first call I get is an Armenian woman from the San Fernando Valley, a constituent. I forgot her name, but you know, my name is so and so, and I'm an Armenian Christian, and I want to talk to Supervisor Yaroslavsky. I said, well, this is Supervisor Yaroslavsky. He said, no, I want to talk to the supervisor. I said, I am the supervisor. She says, you're him? I said, yeah, I'm him. And she's very hostile in her tone. And when she's finally convinced that it's me, she says, well, before I tell you what I called about, you know, I just wanted to let you know that your mother was my teacher, a Hebrew teacher at City College in 1955. And all of a sudden, the conversation took a different direction. And, you know, she mentioned at the end, you know, I'm calling you about the cross, but, you know, I'm more interested in talking about your mother. And this happens to this day. It happens all the time. Now, the people are older now that were her students, but when I'd walk door to door campaigning, people would say, your mother, you know, I remember your mother. She was wonderful, a wonderful teacher, the best teacher I ever had. And so forth. So it's and by the way, I had a constituent of mine in Pacific Palisades who somehow found out that my father had come from Belaya Tserkov, a town about 50 miles southwest of Kiev, a small city, and she thought I'd be interested in having a letter that her uncle or great uncle had written about a trip he took back to Belaya Tserkov in 1921, which happens to be the year my dad left Belaya Tserkov for the United States. And it's an 8-page, single-spaced, handwritten account of what life was like in my dad's hometown at the very time my dad was leaving. And it's a brutal, very graphic description of the anti-Semitism and of the pogroms and all that was going on there. Again, the only way she knew about me is because I was known, and I'm the beneficiary of all that incoming information. And in a way, I'm not in a way, I am very blessed in that regard. But my sister, who's 8 years older than I am, she had the benefit of the tutelage and the mentorship of my mother through her 18th birthday. So my mother and my sister had a more adult relationship as it evolved over the teen years than she talked to my sister about a lot of things she couldn't talk to a 10-year-old about, not least of which was about what happened between her and and our grandmother.
Well, I'm gonna move on to I'd like to move on to another influence.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ask about this influence, this is a more adult influence, I'm gonna look at a picture. Yeah, I can't show the picture, I don't think. When you buy the book, everyone in the audience, you can see the picture. But this influence is someone by the name of Cy Frumpkin.
Yeah.
Cy, you describe as a close as friend as I ever had. And
right.
You also describe Cy Frumpkin as, other than Barbara and your family, the person that influenced you more than anyone. And, of course, I knew Cy myself because Cy introduced us when I was a teenager. I can't believe I was a teenager, but I was a teenager. And I remember meeting you in Cy's kitchen in Studio City. Tell us who was Cy Frumpkin, and how did he influence you?
Well, Cy was a survivor of the Holocaust. He came from Lithuania. He was rounded up in the ghetto of his town, Kovna, one of the larger cities in Lithuania. Then was shipped off to, I believe he was in Dachau at one point, but in labor camps. His father was murdered by the Nazis. His mother survived, and he comes out here. He starts a drapery business, very successful. Lived in a beautiful home in Studio City with a swimming pool. I mean, for a guy who grew up in Boyle Heights, this was, he had the good life, and but he was not satisfied with his good life. We met at a meeting of the Jewish Federation Committee on Soviet Jewry, and I had just come back from the Soviet Union in my first trip there in 1968, and I was determined to start an organization to promote freedom of emigration on campuses from the Soviet Union, and to organize them on campuses. I started at UCLA, and we built chapters all up and down the state of California, and then connected with people across the country. And Cy and I met at this meeting, and we were both dissatisfied with the pace at which the Jewish Federation at that time, they became much more active in the ensuing years. But at the time we met, the most important thing was what the agenda of the next meeting was going to be. It's all about meetings, and not to make a lot of noise. We wanted to pick at the Soviets who came here, not to boycott them, but as an informational thing, to put this issue on the radar screen. We picketed the Moiseyev Ballet, Bolshoi when they came here, the Balalaika Orchestra. When the ships came in to the harbor, there were Soviet ships that delivered goods from the USSR. We spray painted one of the ships with "Let the Jews Go." It's one of my favorite stories, and so forth. Cy had the same frustration that I did, and when we walked out of that meeting, he introduced himself to me. He says, "I like what you had to say," he said to me. and we should get together. And that, he's a very interesting guy, and Holocaust survivor, who could not keep his mouth shut and sit on his rear end while Jews and other people around the globe were suffering, and he was determined not to waste his freedom by sitting by the pool or watching television. And the influence he had on me was from A to Z. How to organize something. He says you need a letterhead. You need to have a stationery. You can't just say you're California Students for Soviet Jews. You need an address. So I got the UCLA Hillel rabbi Richard Levy, a great man, who risked his job to allow me to use the Hillel. Hillel is the umbrella student organization on campuses across the country, and they're funded by the Federation, among others. And he allowed me to use their address, and Cy told me how to go to Postal Instant Press and have them print up a letterhead with your new address on it. I mean, from the mundane to the big picture, which is we are the voice of people who are voiceless. And at least at the beginning, the Soviet Jews, if they opened their mouth, they would be risking their quote unquote freedom, their jobs, their apartment. I tell the story about my bar mitzvah when in 1961, when we got dozens of telegrams from my family's friends and my cousins all over the country and all over the world. Mazel tov on your bar mitzvah. Congratulations on your bar mitzvah. How wonderful on your bar mitzvah day. Everything was bar mitzvah this, bar mitzvah that. We got a telegram from my dad's sisters in Kharkiv, in Ukraine, my two aunts. And it was congratulations on your birthday. And I said to my dad, what's with congratulations on your birthday? This isn't just a birthday. This now I'm becoming a man. This is a big deal. He explained to me that if they had put bar mitzvah in the telegram, first of all, the telegram probably never would have gotten to us. The censor would have stopped it. And number two, they risked being punished for it. And this Cy was just a ball of fire, and remained, my first campaign when I won my first election, the victory party was at his house in Studio City. That's how close we were. We didn't even have a victory party in my district. We couldn't afford to rent a hotel room or anything. So Cy had a nice patio by the pool, and that was, and we remained close friends literally till the day he died. I was with him 2 hours before he died. I had to go give a talk in Agoura Hills. I came back to the hospital in Woodland Hills, and he had passed away in that interim 2 hours. And he was so matter of fact. I mean, he was, in a way, he was so funny. He called me up, and I didn't know he was sick. He had developed brain cancer, and he called me up, and I said, "How you doing, Cy?" He says, "Not well." I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm dying." I said, "It's got to be some kind of a joke." He says, "No, I'm dying, and the reason I'm calling you is I have a favor to ask. I want you to make sure that my archives from the Soviet Jewry movement get placed in a good university archive." And I said, "Well, and I want to come over and talk to you about it." He said. I said, "No, I'm going to come over to your place and talk to you about it." I'm on the board of supervisors at that time, and I had a little bit of influence at my alma mater, and we were able to get his archives, which is one of the most important archives in the activist movement. This is now part of the UCLA library archive, and it's been used for research and things like that. So, I mean, it goes from the beginning, from 1969 when I first met him to 2000, and I think 2009 when he died, and it was a great relationship. Our politics diverged. I mean, he was a very liberal guy when I first met him. He became very conservative in his older years, partly influenced by the whole Soviet experience, the experience of fighting the Soviets. But but he was a seriously smart guy. I mean, he was a Mensa member.
Yes, I remember
When
that.
you talked to him, you had to be on your toes. And
I'm going to
yeah,
mention, because it's interesting, you said his politics diverged from yours. It's a good transition to the next question I had, which was about related to, you call yourself in the book someone who always likes to get things done. And all anyone has to do is look at your past, everything you've done as Exhibit A. That is you. You are someone that gets things done. But I wanted to talk about a specific aspect that I see in the book about how you get things done, which started before you became a councilman and then seems to have continued on right through your time at the Board of Supervisors. And that is, you get things done by working with people who you disagree with on other issues, on many issues. I mean, it started before you were city councilman, right? And it's carried on. And in a political environment that, I think everybody would concede is very polarizing these days. Why and how do you do that? Because that does seem to be characteristic of your ability to get things done.
yeah. Look, in terms of my pre-public service days, the classic relationship that I developed, and I was a very, very liberal anti-war activist, and among other things, the one relationship which people didn't understand then was the relationship I developed with George Putnam, a very conservative television commentator, #1 guy on independent television. We didn't agree on very much, but we agreed on one thing, and that was the Soviet Jewry cause. And I think he enjoyed the spectacle of having a left-wing, activist from UCLA with long hair and a beard come on to his television show, and we became allies in this cause, and he was very instrumental in putting this issue on the radar screen of LA, Southern California, and as a result beyond. I didn't have any problem making, George Washington, I quote him in the book. I don't know the quote by heart, but basically sometimes you have to make alliances with people with whom you don't agree for the greater good.
Like you continue to do that.
I did that throughout my career.
The supervisors, and maybe you're doing it today.
So
what is it that may helps you do it, or lets you do it, or guides you to do it?
It was a different time than it is now. It wasn't nearly as polarized. Local government is not a partisan government structurally. When we run for a local office in this state, you don't run as a Democrat or a Republican. You run it's a nonpartisan office. It's just your name and your occupation. When I got to the city council, I could walk across the hall and talk to a Republican member of the council and say, I have an idea. What do you think? And if he liked the idea, he didn't have to check with the Republican caucus. I didn't have to check with the Democratic caucus. Nobody gave a damn whether you got the credit or I got the credit. It was, as Fiorello LaGuardia, the late mayor of New York, used to say, garbage collection is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It's a municipal issue. And one of the reasons I never ran for partisan office once I got my feet wet in local government is as much of a Democrat as I am, the notion that I'd have to check with leadership either in Sacramento or in Washington about whether I can talk to a Republican member of Congress about something was an anathema to me. And so some of the greatest things we accomplished together in the city council and in the Board of Supervisors was because we were able to, especially at the Board of Supervisors, when I walked into the Board of Supervisors in 1994, we were on the verge of bankruptcy, and we had to figure out a way to back ourselves off the precipice. And I had an idea, and I knew that I needed to get the two Republicans on the Board of Supervisors to agree to it. I knew that the Democrats on the board, I mean, we knew who the Democrats and Republicans were, but we didn't behave like partisans in those days. And I went and talked to Mike Antonovich, who was, the most conservative of the two Republicans. And I proposed this idea to him. He liked it. We launched it. As a result, we were able to figure out a plan of how to get the county finances back on track. We got the Clinton administration to agree. We basically saved the county health system. When I walked into the county, the county health department was in a $700 million deficit. Their whole budget was only $2.5 billion. So like a 30% structural deficit. When I left 20 years later, the county health department had a surplus of $400 million. And by the way, we used the surplus to house patients who were being discharged from our hospitals who otherwise would have been homeless. They didn't have enough resources to even rent an apartment. So it went to good use. That happened because we were able to talk across, so to speak, across the aisle. And there's no shame in doing that. Unfortunately, in Washington, as we sit today, there's great shame in doing that. You can't even hint that somebody on the other side of the aisle has a good idea, even though the idea, the debt ceiling debate, for example, that we had a few months ago, really, you want to risk the full credit of the United States and the consequences that would trigger because it doesn't sell well back in Northwest Georgia or wherever your district is? It's ridiculous, and it's a threat to our democracy that people on both sides of multiple sides of the aisle. Polarization is not just a conservative thing. There's polarization on both sides of the aisle. You got to be able to, for the greater good. This goes back to my grandfather. He was able to deal with revisionist Zionists in Poltava. I mean, he could not talk. It's not like you have that luxury. And if you could cure AIDS, if you could cure cancer, would you not talk to a Republican if he was the one guy who, or a Republican wouldn't talk to a Democrat? Of course not. And by the way, I shouldn't say of course not, because these days, people might say cancer is really not a big deal. That's fake news. It's a totally different ball game. But that's how I did it. And because if you go into this business wanting to get things done, there's only one way to get things done. You have to work with other people. You can't do it yourself. And by the way, thanks for the generous introduction, Terry, but all of the things that I was involved in, whether it was healthcare or whether it was the arts, I didn't do it by myself. I had colleagues, I had staff people, I had department heads, I had the private sector, the philanthropic sector. I mean, I was kind of the impresario, but the real work didn't get done by the politicians. They were done by the people who actually executed the ideas that we had.
I mean, that comes through in the book to me too. I mean, basically, it's much of it is like it's kind of a thank you note to so many people that you show appreciation to. I want to ask you, one of the challenges is that you have been, maybe it's not you and it's all these other people, let's say, that you're working with, been influential in so many things that I have to ask, it may be hard for you, but if there was one, call it an issue, one cause, one something that just touched the heart of who Zev Yaroslavsky is more than any of I mean, just like it's an endless list. Is there one you could think of that speaks to you more deeply, most deeply?
Yeah, the answer is no. It's like asking me which of the 5 grandchildren do you really
right.
And I couldn't pick one. I had a 40-year career, and the reason I was involved in all these issues is because these issues cross the desk, especially across the desk of a county supervisor. Every issue that affects society crosses a supervisor's desk: healthcare, child welfare, poverty, criminal justice, environment, land use, transportation, air quality, you name it. I mean, it's just if you're bored with one thing, wait an hour and something else will come up. And so my fingerprints, as well as those of my colleagues, are on all sorts of issues. And if there's one thing that guided me, there are really two things I would say. One is a quote from a British historian from the 19th century, Lord Thomas Macaulay. One of the things you didn't mention is that I got my master's in British Empire history, and every now and then I quote.
Also shows in the book.
Yeah, I do quote from Macaulay just to make it worth my while to have gone through a graduate program in British Empire history. But Macaulay had a great line. He said, "No man is fit to govern great societies who hesitates about disobliging the few who have access to him for the sake of the many he will never see." And that was the lighthouse against which I and my staff navigated our day-to-day operation. Harry Truman said it a little differently. He said there are 15 million Americans who are represented by associations and federations and consultants and lawyers and lobbyists. The other 150 million are the responsibility of the President of the United States. And that's the way we operated. The big boys, the corporate moguls, the wealthy, they can take care of themselves. They can hire their lawyers and they can try to influence policy. Our job is to be the lobbyist and the consultant and the lawyers for for the many we never see. We need to find them. We need to identify them. We know they're out there, and then we need to promulgate policies that advance their interests, because if we don't, nobody will. So that was one thing. And the other thing, which I ask my students, I teach since I left office. I've been teaching at UCLA now for 8 years. I ask my students, or I tell my students, if you're going to go into public service, and especially elective office, but not just elective office, look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself the following question: which issue am I willing to lose my job over? Which issue am I willing to lose my next election over? Because if you can't answer that question, you're going to be a tool of special interest. You got to have red lines that you will not cross, and you'll be respected for it. You won't be vilified for it. You'll be respected for it, even by your adversaries. And I'm living proof of that.
It comes across in the book.
I took on
you. In fact, if I had to guess, that's what I would have guessed without you answering it.
I took on the LAPD and their abuses in intelligence gathering, which goes back to my trips to the Soviet Union. When one of my dad's sisters, my older aunt, met me in Moscow and gave me a tour. And when we were in Red Square, I whispered to her, I said, what's the situation for Jews in the USSR? And she put her finger to her lips and she said, "Shh, the walls have ears." And I'd never heard that phrase before. And I'm looking around. I said, "What walls? They're 100 yards away." I mean, directional mics were not really a thing then. I don't believe, but she believed it. And it really it had an impact on me. I said, the walls have ears. You can't even talk. I mean, I know you can't talk in your apartment, but we used to use magic slates to communicate when you talked about sensitive issues. And so when I come to the city council, I've come to find out that there's an entire division in the LAPD called the Public Disorder and Intelligence Division. A very nice name. You'd think it had something to do with keeping the public order, but what it was a division that had captains and lieutenants and sergeants and cops whose job it was to keep tabs on people whose political views differed from the chief of police. And there was a list that was made public through a lawsuit of people who had been on the list of targeted list of the LAPD. Included the president of the LA Urban League, the priest at the All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena, several rabbis, Rabbi Leonard Bierman from Leo Beck. I was on it. Cy Frumkin was on it. I would have been insulted if I hadn't have been on the list. But they were spending a lot of money, millions and millions of tens of millions of dollars. The division is a whole operation, and so I took them on. I was advised by my supporters, don't take on the LAPD. They have ways of getting back at you. And I said, well, after you've played hide and seek with the KGB in Moscow and Leningrad, the LAPD is a walk in the park. And so I was willing to take that on. I was willing to take on the issue of the cross and the county seal, as were my two colleagues, Gloria Molina and the late Gloria Molina and Yvonne Braithwaite Burke. We were pummeled, and they were pummeled more than I was, because everybody assumed, well, he's Jewish, he's going to vote to take the cross off. But the two Christians, they're traitors. They're traitors to their own faith. And
But Zev, I want to shift from public policy a little bit to a personal issue that we can, to help us learn. You lost your wife, Barbara, 51 years. And it seemed that you didn't complete the memoir until you lost your wife. Maybe you had much of it done, but it wasn't until Barbara was gone. Help us learn. You're still standing here, and you're still doing, and you're out there, but your 50-year partner would not be the right word. Your wife is gone, but you're still here. How are you getting through it? And did the purpose of your memoir change in any way after Barbara was gone?
Well, it changed in one way, which is I wrote a dedication, 1,500 word dedication, not a 5-word dedication, because it became clear, not became clear, it had always been clear, but it was clear to me that the book had to start with Barbara, because in a way, my mother and father were kind of like me and Barbara. When they talked about my mom and dad, they always talked about them as a couple. Mina and David. We're going to Mina and David's house. When people talk about me or Barbara, it was Zev and Barbara and Zev. She was not, Tammy Wynette, I'm going to stand by my man. And that she was part of this journey, every bit of a part of this journey. As I write in the dedication, she was the first girl I ever, well, maybe not the first girl I ever dated, but in high school I had a miserable date. But the first serious date I had was with her, and I never dated another woman. And she, we decided relatively soon to get married, and we waited a long time because my dad had moved to Israel and we wanted him to be able to come back. He couldn't afford to make trips every year and all that stuff. But we were together for 51 years, married for 47 years, and every single thing that I ever did, her fingerprints are on them. And her death was quite shocking, and she was bitten by a mosquito. She got West Nile virus, and she died from complications related to West Nile virus. I mean, what are the odds of I should have bought a lottery ticket that week. The odds of that happening are next to zero. So it was a period. I stopped writing the book for about a year because I really couldn't focus on it. And then when I finally sucked it up and said, we got to finish this thing, I said, the first thing we're going to do is write the dedication. And she's laced through the whole book. And I couldn't have done her justice in this book, because the book would have been 3 times longer, and it's long enough. But she played everything, and how am I dealing with it? It's not easy. Everybody deals with grief and loss differently. And the good thing is that I've got 5 grandchildren, 2 great kids, and 5 wonderful grandchildren. The youngest of whom was born after she died and has her blue eyes and her auburn curly hair. I mean, it's like, the fates sent us another Barbara, and she's got Barbara's little personality. And all of my grandkids keep me looking to the future. And I say this to all my friends who've had loss is, it's going to be hard for a while. It'll be hard forever, but it'll be harder in the short term. In the long term, keep your family and your memories close, because they will sustain you, and everybody does it in a different way. And my dad lost his wife, my mother. They were married for 25 years, 27 years, something like that. So I think about how he handled it. He handled it totally different. He was also younger than I was, and so in any case, it's yeah, she was very much a part of my life, and I still am blown away by the fact that 1,100 people came to her funeral on the day before New Year's Eve, December 30th, 2018, in a funeral that was not advertised. 1,100 people showed up because she was one of the most beloved people in this town. And up and down the state. She had her own public service career. She was a chair of the Medical Board of California, the Nursing Board, on several local commissions. It was just amazing that that in that synagogue that morning, we had Eli Broad, and you had the woman who cleans our house, from one end of the spectrum to the other, and she was special. There's an old line that I used at her funeral, when Larry King interviewed Bob Strauss, who was Carter's ambassador to the USSR, and he was Democratic Party chair and all this stuff, very influential guy in Washington. He asked Strauss, who was a Texan, to describe himself to the American people. And Strauss says, well, Larry, more people know the Pope than know Bob Strauss, but Bob Strauss knows more people than the Pope does. And I said, man, that's Barbara. When that interview took place years ago, I said, that's Barbara. More people know me than know her, but she knows more people than I do. And if you wanted to get anything done, you called her up. You wanted an autopsy expedited, you called her up. You wanted to find a boy or a girl for your son or daughter, she'd hook you up. That's how my daughter and son-in-law got married. His mother and Barbara conspired. They were part of the same mahjong group, and they conspired. And what were the odds that my daughter would ever take her mother's advice for who she should marry? And it worked out. And so it's a woman who had unlimited capacity to build friendships, and had no enemies. I mean, none.
I'm going to take a quote toward then. This is for our last question, that you say that Barbara hung on in your kitchen, and maybe it's still there. I don't know, but you'll know the quote. But I'd like to ask you to have that quote as a setup for a question for you about your vision of Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
So the quote is, you say, Barbara hung in the kitchen the following, this sign. It says, a pessimist has no motor, an optimist has no brakes. If you can give us a vision of the city and county of Los Angeles, give it from the perspective of an optimist, which I gather you are, but a practical optimist, but also as perhaps a pessimist, but a realistic pessimist. Give us putting those together. What's your vision of what this city and county hold for the rest of us?
Well, it's not good politics to be too pessimistic, but I am more of a pessimist than Barbara was. She wasn't a pessimist at all. She had no brakes. There was nothing that she didn't think she could accomplish, and that's why she accomplished so much. But I'm a little more conservative in my optimism. I think LA is facing a lot of challenges. I don't think that they're all I don't think they're insolvable, insoluble. I do think some of them are going to take time, and I'm more concerned about the the national and frankly the international politics that have been infected with this polarization and demonization of the other side, which makes it almost impossible in a country that's divided. You know, it's happening here, it's happening in Israel, and it's a bigger threat to Israel than it is to us because it's a smaller place and the stakes are very high. The stakes are pretty high here too. I'm very concerned about it. I don't know how it's all going to end. You know, you look even in France, England is not immune from this. You know, the Brexit thing a few years back could have led down a certain path. It's democracy, and this is the big problem, that in the eyes of the public, the systems aren't working for them. The economic inequality, the income inequality, for which Los Angeles is ground zero, has to be addressed. I am very sympathetic to labor and the strikers right now. You can't have the CEOs and the COOs of the major corporations of this country increasing their wealth and their compensation at double-digit, triple-digit rates when their employees are, you know, making it in the low, have had increases in the low single digits for the last decade or more. It's not sustainable. And this is not a philosophical point of view. It's a practical point of view. You cannot have, to paraphrase Lincoln, a nation that's half rich, that's 1% rich and 75% poor, and have a shrinking middle class. You cannot have that. It's not politically sustainable. Why do I say it's not politically sustainable? Because what you see taking place in Washington, in Sacramento, at City Hall, for that matter, is when people have no hope. To quote Janis Joplin, you know, freedom's just another thing for nothing left to lose. Nothing left to lose. And they've got nothing left to lose, and we've got to deal with that. We talk about the homeless, and it's a serious problem, and the housing affordability crisis, and it's a very serious problem. But that's part of it's only part of the equation. Housing is expensive. Part of the reason it's expensive is because it's been commoditized, but part of the reason is because people can't afford to pay what the going rate is. And so you have two sides to the equation. You have income of the customer, and you have the price set by the owner. And somewhere there has to be a meeting of the minds. And this is not an environment, a political environment, where people are willing to come together. And because if you do, you're called a traitor. You're a Republican in name only. You're whatever. I mean, you know the drill. That's what worries me more than LA. LA is a great place. I mean, and we have a lot. I mean, I've lived in this city all my life. I grew up in Boyle Heights for 8 years. I've lived in the Fairfax area for the other 68 years, 66 years. I've lived within 8 blocks of the house my parents bought, the only house they ever owned, and I love it. Am I concerned about, you know, rising crime rates? Yeah. Am I concerned about homelessness? You bet. And I tried to do something about it when I was on the county board. I couldn't get a lot of support for it at the time. Now it's an issue. You know, but when you step back a second, think about this city. We have it culturally. It's extraordinarily diverse, and it manifests in the cultural institutions that we have, and will continue to grow and spread in that way. We have some of the greatest cultural institutions in the world here. I wrote a speech back in the mid-90s about, I called it the golden age of the arts in Los Angeles. There was a 10-year period when we built Disney Hall. We had rebuilt the Natural History Museum and Exposition Park. The Getty was built. The Getty Villas in Pacific Palisades was refurbished. The San Fernando Valley Performing Arts Center at Cal State Northridge was built. The Hollywood Bowl was refurbished and turned into a 21st century amphitheater instead of the 1940s and 50s that it was. And so all done in one decade, all done in 1 decade, and I didn't give you the whole list. Pinch yourself. There's no other metropolitan area in the history of mankind that had so much cultural infrastructure built in 1 decade. And we had it all. And since then, there's been even more. I tell you that not everybody's a culture fan, not everybody is a classical music fan, but it's a huge part of our economy. The creative economy is a big part. Is one of the stools in the triad, or four-legged stool of our economy. We sell more books. Like when I wrote that speech, we sold more books in LA than they sold in New York. We had more theaters in LA than they had in New York. Nobody knows that because New York had done a better job messaging that. But look at what we have just on that side of things. Not to mention opportunities. And LA is a place. Southern California is a place. Has been a place where you can be anything you want to be if you take your shot. And you got to be lucky. You got to work hard. But you will not be stopped because your name is Magady or your name is Washington. If you want to work at it. It's not like being some of the old East Coast cities where if you're not born into a certain family, you might as well hang it up. You'll be on the outside looking in. There are a lot of people outside looking in here too, but there are more opportunities here, and with the work that we can do to make it a more hospitable place and a more equitable place, I think we need to do that. But my main concern is not about the city per se. I think the city is a dynamic place. I think I'm a believer in the Bill of Rights. I'm a believer that just because you have the majority doesn't mean you're right. And in a democracy, majority rules, but majorities responsibly also have to take into account the interests of the minorities. And I say minorities, not just racial minorities, but philosophical, ideological minorities. There's got to be room at the table for everybody, because if you can do what some of the countries are doing now, I'm going to do X because I can. I'm going to show you. Look at what's happening in the state of Wisconsin right now. We're going to impeach the Supreme Court Chief Justice because we have the votes. If I had done that as a politician, if every time I did something crazy just because I had the votes, I wouldn't feel good about myself, and it wouldn't be the right thing to do. So we need to become more adult, and not scream at each other as much. The LA City Council, my daughter-in-law is on the city council, so occasionally I'll watch it, not for long. Because the public testimony that people get from in the city hall, the words that are used are obscene, literally obscene, words that can't be said on television, but you can be on I guess on cable television. It's okay. And the city council meetings, which are televised, have a disclaimer at the beginning that basically said, I'm paraphrasing, caution. It's a public meeting. The words you may hear may be offensive to you. So basically beware if you don't like offensive language.
Incredible. A city council meeting. That would be like an R-rated show or something.
Yeah. Well, it's exactly what it is. I can't take my grandson to see his mom in action because he's going to hear words that he's taught not to say. And it's pathetic. It's it really, and I'm a First Amendment hawk, but I don't think you have the right to disrupt in the way that's gone on, and this is a result of a court case that goes back a number of years. I'm not even familiar with the court case, but no judge would allow this kind of behavior in their courtroom, but they allow it in the city council chamber and the Board of Supervisors hearing room. It's all the same. That's got to, and part of that is theater. People like to hear themselves on television. Part of it is there are people who are really desperate, and we need to recognize this. And I'll close with this, Terry. It's a statistic which blows the mind of academics and non-academics alike. I do a survey every year at UCLA. It's a countywide survey. 38% of our households in the county have household incomes of less than $60,000 a year. 38%, almost 1 in 4, almost 4 in 10. 18%, almost 1 in 5, have household incomes of less than $30,000 a year. Now, if you want to get a 2-bedroom apartment for your 3 kids and your husband and wife, that's $18,000 a year. If you're at the high end of that range, making $30,000 a year, all you have left for everything else is $12,000 for your kit, your clothes, your food, your medicines, all of that stuff. And that's not sustainable. And that's the city we live in. So in Beverly Hills, God bless Beverly Hills, I represented it for 20 years, and Barbara came from Beverly Hills. I came from Boyle Heights. We both BH kids, but from different walks of life. The world doesn't, the county doesn't look like Beverly Hills or Westwood or Bel Air or Palisades or Brentwood. It looks like Pico Rivera and El Monte and West Covina, and drive through some of the communities, even 15 minutes away from Beverly Hills. It's a different world. And understand what's driving some of this this desperation, because the income gap is, and I'm not even going to go into why we have it, what the reason is. All I'm telling you, that's not sustainable. I've landed from Mars. I've taken a look at this. Hey, humans, this won't work for long. And what you'll end up with is, somebody, some dictator who's going to promise the world, who's going to know how to exploit grievances, whether it's in Hungary or whether it's here or whether it's wherever. It's not sustainable, and that's my worry. That's my pessimism. But as a resident of LA, I often say, if I didn't have grandkids, I'd move to Montana. Well, I'm not going to move to Montana, and I'm not going to move to the southern end of the southern island of New Zealand to be as far away from humanity as I get. I love the city. It's in my book is Jim Newton in his review so beautifully said. It's kind of it's a love story with Barbara. It's a love story with my city. I love LA. And that doesn't mean that I love every part of it and every aspect of it, but this is an exciting place. I could not have done what I've done in LA, in Cincinnati, or in Cleveland, or in Chicago. It just wouldn't have worked. This is a city that rewards optimism, rewards hard work, rewards big ideas, and California is as well. But we have a lot of work to do.
Zev, what a pleasure. What a pleasure. I really enjoyed this. I wish we can go another hour.
Well, thanks, Terry.
Anyway,
thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Zev. It was great hearing from you, and great listening to all the stories and everything else you have to share. So thank you very much. Okay.
Good to see you. Thanks, Terry. Bye-bye.